Yes.
Yeah, I take this opportunity to thank Professor Pentavadia and Abhishek and Vinash, everybody. It's indeed an honor to talk about some of the works that Professor Parisi did in his early days. Okay, and in fact, I was fortunate enough to read some of his earliest works, not the later ones, because I work in particle physics. Okay, I'm sure you know particle physics would agree to me. Every one of us actually working in particle physics would definitely encounter this famous paper by Professor Parisi along with Altarelli on Altarelli-Parisi evolution equation, and without which actually we cannot actually proceed, because this is one of the pioneering works which even today when we write papers, this paper figures. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the things I learned. I don't know, my screen is not moving. Okay, so sorry. Yeah, so this is the paper that I mentioned as a graduate student. As you can see, it's one of the most famous papers that have been written in high energy physics, also in physics. It's got more than 7,500 citations and more than that actually, because now it's become a textbook material. Was one of those who talked about asymptotic freedom and connecting it to something that experimentalists would be happy to hear, you know, how one can understand the patterns in a particular language. Okay, so this is one of the famous papers. And the topic that I'm going to talk about today is on infrared divergences. So this is something that we would definitely looked at it actually at some point, because this is one of the first papers which talks about extending the ideas that were known in the context of ultraviolet divergences, okay, in quantum field theory, to the completely different kind of divergence, namely infrared divergences, how this can be actually dealt with, you know, the way ultraviolet divergences are dealt with using this PPH approach. There was an attempt to actually extend this idea to deal with infrared divergences, because infrared divergences were there. I mean, in perturbative QCD, when people started calculating, you know, beyond leading order corrections to many of these observables that experimentalists could measure. Okay, and this was a big issue: how to deal with these infrared divergences. Okay, and this paper was one of those earlier papers on this actually. So I'm going to talk about, you know, the development that took place, in particular in some narrow areas in high energy physics, where the understanding of these ideas, okay, the role of it, and then how the field developed actually, and also some work that I did with some of my students in recent times. So LHC actually played an important role. I mean, to actually, you know, open up again this precision physics, through which actually theorists have, you know, sort of started investing quite a lot of time calculating things, because it's precision. So you need to calculate things as precisely as possible. When you start computing and getting the results, we also would like to look at the results and see what is the underlying, you know, structure that are hidden in it actually. So this exercise led to many interesting things, like, you know, and, you know, understand this infrared physics in terms of certain universal quantities, universal anomalous dimensions, which are nothing to do with the process that we study. Okay, this universal structure that emerges out of all these computations are, I mean, hidden in some of these quantities, like, you know, Altarelli-Parisi evolution equations and coefficient functions and things like that. This is something that I'm going to discuss today. So both, you know, experimentalists and also theorists, okay, to understand the data, played an important role actually to compute things as precisely as possible. Historically, as we know that, you know, this predictions from QCD, that scaling violations were tested, you know, at deep inelastic scattering experiments, and then, you know, the jets in at LEP actually provided hints about the dynamics of QCD, in particular about the gluon dynamics. And then this precision computations also helped us to actually even to get hints about particles like top, Higgs, and Thixler when they were not discovered. So all these informations that precision physics played an important role to actually understand something that we would like to know, like in particular for example, if you want to know about fate of the universe, certain computations in electroweak physics, particularly how the Higgs mass is related to the top mass and things like that, can talk about these things. One of the famous example that I would like to quote here is actually if you look at the predictions from QCD on the prediction of Higgs boson rates. Okay, some of these precise computations, led to very precise measure, values that actually helped to pin down where the Higgs boson was, and it was discovered in 2012 at around that time, thanks to such precise computations. So precise computations are not just helping us to understand the physics of it, and also to understand the structure of case theories. That's what I'm going to talk about today, actually. So let's restrict ourselves to, let's say, QCD or SU and case theory in general. And in particular, I want to restrict myself to only a particular type of sector, namely the infrared sector. I'll not talk about anything on ultraviolet part sector. Quantum field theories with massless particles encounter usually two kinds of infrared divergences. One of them is called soft divergence, which arise due to presence of massless gauge bosons. While there are also collinear divergences, which are present in these case theories with matter fields. This happens when two of the particles become collinear to each other. If there are configurations in phase space, you will where the two massless gauge bosons are almost massless, let's say matter fields become collinear to each other. So physical processes that happen at long distances are responsible for these divergences, because long distance physics is associated with configurations that are experimentally indistinguishable. Measurable quantities are not sensitive to soft and collinear divergences. So hence, what you need to do is actually, we need to construct certain quantities which go under the name infrared safe quantities. Okay, by which I mean that you can actually define or construct only those quantities. If you compute them, it will not encounter any unpleasant situations like divergences resulting from any of the soft and collinear regions. Okay, of course there are guidelines, and there are a couple of theorems actually which we might have studied in our graduate times, Black-Knott theorem and KLN theorems, which actually tells you exactly what kind of things that you can actually compute. What are the infrared safe quantities? Okay, so infrared divergences, this is a textbook material that every one of us are familiar with, but let's go over it a little bit. So this infrared divergences are present in scattering amplitudes, or even on-shell amplitudes or off-shell amplitudes, through processes like this. Actually, if you have, let's say, an emission of gluons from a quark and an anti-quark, you can actually encounter a soft divergence because of a propagator, which can actually end up with unpleasant situations like this 1 over k0, which k0 goes to 0, will give infrared divergence. And also you can have divergences coming from collinearity. For example, if the gluon and a quark or anti-quark becomes collinear to each other, the cos theta can go to +1 and leading to collinear divergences. Of course, we know that these collinear, the soft divergences and collinear divergences, they are present in every scattering process that you look at LHC or at LEP or whichever experiment that we are talking about. And we need to know how to deal with such divergences. And when you compute things For example, in the case of Drelian process, if you compute any higher order radiative corrections, you will find that these IR divergences are there everywhere. Okay, and of course, we can go ahead and start computing things. For example, real emission diagrams or virtual diagrams and so on and so forth. And thanks to some of these theorems and infrared, that we are calculating infrared safe observables, that all these soft divergences, they will cancel each other. Okay, you can see very nicely in one of the slides, actually I'll show you that if you have soft divergences resulting from gluons, okay, they cancel between the real and virtual diagrams if you sum all the degenerate states. Okay, but however, if you in this kind of calculations, what you do actually is sum up all the final state configurations, and you don't sum up the initial state configuration simply because you prepare two initial hadrons, and then that will have a certain energy and momentum. Okay, you don't sum them up actually. Hence, there are collinear singularities in the initial states that remain as it is actually. Okay, this is where this famous work of Sternman and people like Altarelli and Parisi enters. For example, if you have initial state collinear singularities, okay, they don't cancel up because you don't sum up initial states. Okay, so the way the initial state singularities are actually taken care of is through mass factorization. For example, if you start with an hadronic cross section, which actually is is convolution of, let's say, hadronic partonic cross sections multiplied by the PDFs, which we call actually parton distribution functions. These partonic cross sections often encounter what they call collinear singularities, because the initial state may contain a couple of partons which can go collinear to each other. The way to deal with is actually like the way we deal with ultraviolet divergences. If you can show that the cross sections factorize into certain singular functions and a finite quantity. The singular functions I call gammas, and the finite quantity I call delta. If such a thing exists, then you are through. So we need to actually establish this fact that every partonic cross section can be factorizable as a singular gammas and a finite delta. Okay, of course, for infrared safe observables, one can actually show rigorously to all orders in perturbation theory, in particular in SU and gauge theories, that such a factorization do exist. Okay, and these gammas are usually called Altarelli-Parisi evolution kernels, and these kernels are process independent, because you will see that why it has to be process independent. However, these deltas are process dependent actually. So if such a factorization exists, then you can plug in the original formula and define your the bare parton densities by multiplying this gamma and end up with the renormalized PDFs, which means it's exactly like in the case of ultraviolet divergences, by factoring Green's functions which are singular as a finite renormalization constant times divergent renormalization constant times finite quantity. So it's exactly like a renormalization of some certain composite operators or Green's functions. We can actually perform even in the infrared sector, that you can absorb the divergent quantity into this bare parton densities, and by doing so, we can actually write down this hadronic cross section, which initially looked like product of divergent quantities due to collinear singularities. Here we can actually show that by absorbing them, you can actually make the entire right hand side with quantities that are finite, collinear finite. So this kind of a renormalization of PDFs with the help of this Altarelli-Parisi evolution kernels actually leads to very interesting results, namely the renormalization group equation. For example, the fact that this F hat is independent of the point at which the singularities are removed, okay, it leads to this identity, which in turn turns out to be a differential equation of this kind actually. This is simply a renormalization group equation for the PDFs, it's very analogous to the renormalization group equation that we see in the ultraviolet sector. And these P's are nothing but anomalous dimensions because they contain the scaling variables corresponding to the particular process that we study. We actually have some kind of tau dependent or the function that is dependent on a scaling variables. So there is one-to-one correspondence with the anomalous dimension that we study in infrared sector, and the anomalous dimension here it's called the splitting functions in the infrared sector. And this was the famous equation, celebrated equation by Altarelli and Parisi in 1978 paper, where they showed that this renormalization group equations, this you end up with, if you include, both quark as well as gluons, because they studied this in the context of QCD, you have a matter field and also gauge fields. Hence, they mix under renormalization group equations. Hence, the anomalous dimension, or so-called the Altarelli-Parisi splitting functions, is not just single entity; it's a matrix, and all this matrix is calculable in perturbation theory, and the leading order diagrams would look something like this actually. Thanks to several advances in the computational methods, okay, people could actually go beyond the leading order, which is a one loop diagrams, to next to leading order it is two loop, and next to leading order three loop levels. And as you can see, the number of diagrams actually grow very fast. And then of course there are techniques to compute all of them. And then you can get a nice expression, but which cannot be shown in a sheet of paper. We need actually some 20-page long sheet actually, to show this. So people even had gone beyond three loops to get results of this kind actually. Of course, to a layman, it would look like some expressions containing color factors and some transcendental numbers. Of course, I will show you that these results contain very rich perturbative structure, having certain universal quantities. Okay, so in particular, actually, if you look at Altarelli-Parisi evolution equation, or the evolution that gamma satisfy, okay, and look at the splitting function that appears here, analogous to anomalous dimensions, you find that this in the threshold limit. That means if you expand this scaling variable that appears in all these cross sections, around z equal to 1, it has got a very beautiful expansion, and you can identify these coefficients which appear in many other areas of gauge theories. For example, the one that appears in front of this distribution 1 over 1 minus z, this plus distribution, okay, is called cusp anomalous dimension, which is universal, and it is also related to some cusp appear in Wilson loops in gauge theories. And another one which appears here, which is the coefficient of delta 1 is called the collinear anomalous dimension. And C is actually also another collinear anomalous dimension, so on and so forth. All these anomalous dimensions which appear as a coefficient of this, curly D as well as delta function and then log 1 minus z, all universal, and they appear in different places. And they are universal in the sense, actually, when you compute processes of completely of different nature, you can find out in certain scaling limits, you end up with certain anomalous dimensions which are expressed in terms of this A, B, C, D, etc. Okay, so there exists a solution. Okay, so this is about understanding, the splitting function that one is familiar with in the context of Altarelli-Parisi splitting, Altarelli-Parisi evolution equations. Of course, the Altarelli splitting functions are only part of this observables. Okay, the another part which I mentioned in the beginning is these coefficient functions, which are basically this mass factorized pattern level cross sections. Namely, these are nothing but cross sections where all the collinear singularities are factored out and absorbed into the pattern distribution functions. Hence, these deltas are basically finite quantities which are obtained from this kind of scattering processes or scattering amplitudes. Okay, and of course, as I said, in the case of splitting functions, these also demonstrate very rich perturbative structure, And some of these quantities that I'm going to talk about contain these universal anomalous dimensions, very, very specific to SU and Gauge theories. Okay, so if you look at this hadronic cross sections, we already had seen that it factorizes. This is one such cross sections where you can factorize a hadronic cross section in terms of pattern level cross section, delta times the incoming partonic flux phi. Okay, so we'll concentrate only on deltas. Deltas you can actually split us into sum of two distinct quantities. One which goes by the name soft plus virtual. As name suggests, this part of the delta results from configurations where only soft ones and there are only virtual diagrams contribute. Of course, when we talk about Feynman diagrams splitting real and virtual part, we need to be careful. We need to split them into groups where no gauge invariance is violated within each group actually. So we can actually do this exercise without disturbing the gauge invariance. This split is a gauge invariant split. So you can actually collect infrared safe delta SV and infrared safe delta H. H corresponds to hard part. That means anything other than the soft plus virtual, we name them hard part actually. So the soft plus virtual part contains distributions of this kind. Okay, this is the delta function, and the other one is called plus distribution function. It could be any power of log actually. Just an example. And on the other hand, the hard part contains very complicated, multiple polylogs. They called harmonic polylogs, which could be of any power in n and p, and you get horrendous expressions in terms of these integrals actually. Okay, so the next two. So how much time I'm left with actually?
You can take 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So we had sort of tried to investigate in the threshold limit as z goes to 1 or certain limits. We can expand this hard part also in the soft virtual part and see whether there are universal structures, because this is only the reminder of after you do the mass factorization. So hence all the information that we see in the case of Altarelli-Parisi splitting functions, that should be reflected in this coefficient functions also. So we looked at what they call soft plus virtual. Soft plus virtual, of course, is a well understood. It dates back to work of George Sherman and Catani and so on and so forth. Particularly, when people studied this, a certain type of what they call diagonal processes, you could see that actually the diagonal processes demonstrate very nice and simple looking factorization containing only one single piece actually, which means that if you understand these gammas very well, then we can actually make conjectures about these deltas even before you compute these quantities. The fact that delta is finite actually tells you how you can parameterize them actually. So here is a master formula that people have invented by looking at this factorization formula, where you can actually show that the entire partonic finite cross section decomposes beautifully in terms of certain form factors and the soft part, and then this logarithm of Altarelli-Parisi splitting functions. Thanks to this structure and several of these differential equation that these constituents, or this the terms that constitute this entire cross section, they independently satisfy several renormalization group equations, k plus g equation, and so on and so forth. And understanding of these, the solutions from fixed order computations actually led to, I'll skip this slides because I'm getting late. So led to solutions which you can actually compute and then express them as kind of an exponentials. Okay, because all of them are first order differential equations, and in dimensional regularization, we can actually find the solution and we can express the solutions in terms of these universal quantities. For example, ultraviolet renormalization constant is completely dictated by the anomalous dimensions, And the form factors that we study, even in our graduate term, the form factors, they are actually controlled by certain infrared anomalous dimensions which go by the name gamma. And just now we saw that actually these PDFs, evolutions, are controlled by these splitting functions. And what is less known is the soft function. And in fact, we have shown in one of our papers, even the soft function satisfy what is called this Sudakausa, K plus G equation, whose solution can be obtained again as an integral equation. And this integral equation will look exactly like this, one of the things that I've shown here. So at the end of the day, that if you look at the finite delta or this coefficient function, you can show that particularly for this diagonal channels, that the entire thing can be expressed as exponential of certain anomalous dimensions which are universal. So in certain limits, you can actually show that, I will actually skip some of them, the entire solution to this, the soft part that I was talking about, where there are this soft plus virtual and hard part, they contain certain universal structures which are dictated by these anomalous dimensions, namely, the cusp anomalous dimension and collinear anomalous dimensions, okay, which actually tell you that there is a universality in all these hadronic processes. These universalities are something to do with the infrared structure of the gauge theory, and hence we have a better understanding of how some of these observables actually evolve as you change the scale of the process. So, like in the case of ultraviolet divergences, these anomalous dimensions actually dictate how certain Green's functions evolve with the scale. Here also, these infrared anomalous dimensions dictate how the infrared, the physics when at the infrared region, how it scales as a function of these, the unphysical scales or a physical scales. So this evolution is completely dictated by the so-called infrared anomalous dimensions. These are just analogous to ultraviolet anomalous dimensions that we are familiar with. The only difference between this ultraviolet anomalous dimensions and the infrared anomalous dimensions are basically the main difference is actually in the case of infrared, ultraviolet anomalous dimensions, every composite operator that you think of, the anomalous dimension would depend on the type of composite operator that you look at. While in the case of infrared, you will find that the large class of diagrams, okay, in a given gauge theory, you can show that they are completely governed by few infrared anomalous. And in that sense, actually, there is a rich perturbative structure that infrared sector enjoys when you compare it with the ultraviolet sector. And there are quite a lot of work about how you can actually understand various gauge theory amplitudes using these factorization properties and in terms of various renormalization techniques. So finally, I will just mention only one aspect of this, namely if you can show that in the large Z region, where the threshold, what they call threshold regions, the entire, okay.
Can you maybe you can summarize that?
Yeah, I'm almost through actually. So so basically, you can show that in certain regions in the infrared sector of the computable cross section, for example, delta here can be shown as exponential of some universal function called psi, and the psi as a expansion of this kind where you have distributions and then regular functions. All of them are integrable. Okay, and this has a very nice predictive power that knowing certain lower order results, we can actually predict certain large logarithms to all orders in perturbation theory. So like in renormalization group equations, basically if you know certain terms in lower orders, you can actually predict logarithms to all orders. So there is a predictive power thanks to certain renormalization group equations that these quantities satisfy. Okay, I think I'll stop here. And I want to thank again for the organizers to talk about some of these works which are connected to Professor Parisi's earliest works. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Ravi, for this very nice exposition.